In the interest of time, we're going to get started now. Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Burns and I am the Marketing Assistant for Anthropology at Oxford University Press. As a department of Oxford University and as a non-for-profit higher education publisher, Oxford University Press is uniquely situated to offer the highest scholarship at the best possible prices in print and digital format. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I especially want to thank Drs. Robert Welsch and Luis Vivanco for taking time out of their schedule to lead our discussion. Robert Welsch, who received his PhD at University of Washington, is the Associate Professor of Anthropology at Franklin Pierce University. He is a co-author of several books and is the Research Associate and Adjunct Curator at multiple museums throughout the country. Luis Vivanco, who received his PhD at Princeton, is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Founding Director of the Global Studies Program at the University of Vermont. He is an author or co-author of 4 books, as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters. He is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards for anthropological research fieldwork support. Our presenters are also co-authors of OUP's Cultural Anthropology, Asking Questions About Humanity, which is shaped around this webinar's discussion. After the webinar, please feel free to preview the instructor manual online on our Oxford Presents website, which they tailor to this pedagogical vision. I will send out the link to all attendees after the webinar. Before we get started, I'm going to mute everyone on the line except for our presenters so we don't have any issues with background noise. At the end of the session, we will have question and answer session. So keep in mind on the webinar control panel that there is a question box, and feel free to type in any questions or comments at any point during the talk, and we will address them at the end. And without further ado, we are going to kick things off. So over to you, Drs. Welsch and Vivanco.
Hi everybody, I'm Luis Vivanco.
Rob Welsh.
Thank you all for joining us here today. We're sitting in my office at the University of Vermont, and we're going to hope that my piles of paper and books don't fall on top of us in the next hour. So Rob and I have a 10-year collaboration that resulted in this textbook with OUP. And what drives our collaboration is a genuine love of teaching anthropology students and teaching them especially how to think anthropologically. We have sat for hours and hours at a time just sharing tips and exploring common problems and thinking through how do we really engage our students so that they are exposed to the power of the anthropological way of knowing that we as practitioners have developed over the years. So what we're hoping to draw you in today is to some of the fruits of our own thinking around that, and also to be enriched by whatever questions and comments and issues you have, because for us these are ongoing questions, even though we've been doing these things for decades between us.
We find that every single semester we teach, we come up with new classes of students or new groups of students, and we got new issues on what the students don't know this year that the students a couple of years ago did know. And how do you frame it in such a way so they'll understand what we're talking about even? And students don't know much about contemporary events. And so you had to fill them in, but we like to use a lot of contemporary events to make our discipline real and very present for people. And we've structured a lot of our teaching around those issues.
So let's give you an overview of what we plan to cover today. Why that's not going there. There we go. We want to address basically 4 distinct issues. The first is, what does it mean to teach students to think anthropologically, and why should we be doing this? There's we can name colleagues who would disagree with us, that that's not necessarily our goal with the undergraduate level, that we should be doing other kinds of things like teaching them how to respond to the kinds of questions we ask, teaching them how to take good tests, things like that.
How to use Excel.
How to use Excel,
How to use a good library bibliographic citation style.
Right.
And those are not unimportant things, of course, but we don't think that's about thinking anthropologically. That's just academics. But one of the things that's important is how can we cultivate curiosity amongst our students so they go in the directions that we have ourselves gone in our careers from knowing very little to getting excited about problems and pursuing those.
And so another piece of that is how do we encourage interactive learning among our students. Rob and I love to enter into all kinds of dialogues with our students and have them dialogue with each other, and that we find that interactive learning is really critical. And so the last thing we'll cover is, how do you do this no matter what the class size? We have experience teaching small seminars of 15 or 10 all the way up to over 200. Largely what we're going to talk about today is inspired by introductory level courses, but we're going to be drawing in materials that you can apply at any level, intermediate or advanced, undergraduate as well. And so we're primarily talking about the undergraduate audience here today. So let's get started.
So what does it mean to think anthropologically? And recognizing how, why, and under what circumstances the basic disciplinary concepts of anthropology are relevant. It's not just relevant to us as faculty, to you guys and to us, but it's how it's going to be relevant to the students. And I have found, for example, that it really is helpful to not give students a list of terms to memorize, but if you really want them to know what holism is, put it on the board the first time you introduce it, tell them what it is, talk about it, give an example, and every day for the next 3 weeks, you talk about an example, say, remember this is holism. This is an example of holism, for example. And I find that then, by the end of the term, the students are using holism in their language in conversation in class, and you have gotten them thinking holistically because they know what it is and they can actually start doing it.
I think a lot of what this approach inspires is one in the teacher where we're looking for ways to utilize the concepts of anthropology so that we're not learning about anthropology alone or so much as we're learning with anthropology or we're learning in anthropology by using its concepts. We think that another piece here is developing critical thinking abilities among our students. We believe that needs to start at the earliest levels of anthropological education. So we don't think that the goal of an introductory course should be just to teach, quote unquote, the basic concepts, but it should be also developing those critical thinking skills. And we'll get into what we mean by that.
And one of the things you will probably notice at your own home universities is that administrators are getting really invested in assessments and learning outcomes, and critical thinking is one of those learning outcomes that is absolutely centered on what anthropologists do. I just heard on CNN yesterday there was a discussion about the war on the arts and sciences in colleges. Everybody's talking about teaching students for professional training in one field or another in STEM courses and so on. We have no objection to those things, but it was interesting. On the panel they had on CNN, all of those people had gone through the arts and sciences, or the liberal arts, and none of them were doing scientific things. And what were their key skills? They know how to think critically. They know how to read effectively and critically, and they know how to write and communicate well. And so we see this as central to the university's core goals. And one of the things you want to talk to your administrators about, your deans and whatever, is how thinking critically is one of the things that we can teach our students through an anthropology course.
We also are to come back to holism, we think that introducing holism early, that holistic perspective early on, is really one of the distinctive outcomes of any course. And so, it's really about helping students make the connections across those distinct domains of knowledge, or so that when they're confronted with a problem or a scenario, that they're beginning to make the kinds of connections that we make. They're starting to ask the sorts of connective linking questions that we ourselves are asking. And that holistic perspective is really one of those absolutely distinctive dimensions of the anthropological perspective.
One of the things that we find is most challenging in the classroom And both of us do teach in the classroom, although I'm starting to develop an online course right now, and so I'm getting ready to be working online, and it's a little more difficult when you aren't face-to-face with the students. But getting them to have curiosity about things is the real challenge. So one of the things is to use what interests us, that we hear in the news or something. I know Luis and I both are bringing things in from the news, whatever is current events, NPR, whatever Diane Rehm or NPR is talking about that day. You can always find something that is relevant to almost any course you're teaching if you feel like it. And bring that in and show whatever we're talking about has a relevance to the present.
Yeah, I think of what Albert Einstein once said about curiosity. He said it's a miracle that curiosity survives formal education. and I'm very dedicated to generating curiosity in my students because that is really what opens the world to think about in new ways, and it's one of the absolutely basic skills of thinking anthropologically. It's just starting to ask questions about your immediate life world in many cases. So the question, of course, is why? Why should we do this? As I said, I think we've certainly worked with colleagues who don't necessarily agree with us right off the bat that our goal, especially at the introductory level, is to teach students how to think anthropologically. Well, one is that we think an ounce of dialogue is worth a pound of monologue. In other words, that sage on the stage approach is one that it can appeal to a certain kind of learner. But when you start recognizing that there are multiple learning styles in your classroom, that once you start breaking down that unidirectional approach and generating dialogue between students through, whether it's through activities, that's kind of some of the things we'll talk about in a bit, or breaking down that sort of direct flow from you to the students, that it begins to help generate those possibilities for thinking anthropologically.
And one way of doing this is to ask questions of your students. I have done this with classes of 100 or more students, but it's much easier in a smaller classroom as I have now. Most of my larger classes have 24, 28 students in them. But in a class of 28, everybody talks during the hour because I'm constantly throwing out questions that are not just yes, no, what's the population of China kinds of questions, but are open-ended questions. And students often don't get it right. They don't want to answer because they've never thought of the question before. And I start that from the very beginning of the term, the very first day. They practically are in mutiny mode by week 3, but by week 4 they've gotten used to it, and then it's smooth sailing the rest of the time. And everybody talks. They're stumped at times, and it doesn't matter what their answer is because we're not looking for right answers. We're getting them to think through the process of figuring out answers to questions and how do you go about it. And so I think that getting that dialogue going early on in a classroom is really exciting. With a larger class, if you've got 100 or 200 students, it's a lot harder to get that kind of dialogue, and it's usually going to be some of the brighter students are going to want to engage. But even there, you can shake it up by calling on people randomly.
Well, we'll get into some of the techniques that I have developed here at the University of Vermont of how do you cultivate that dialogue in a much larger class. We also think that it's worth doing because it helps students understand the application of anthropological insights and methods across different knowledge domains. Now, I'm an environmental anthropologist, and a lot of the work that I do is primarily interdisciplinary, because when you start thinking about what are the challenges facing the environment and some of the possible solutions to those challenges, you start leaving particular or singular knowledge domains, and you really start moving into interdisciplinary territory. And so one of the things that I often am trying to do is help students bring an anthropological criteria or set of insights into these sort of interdisciplinary problem areas so that we can, first of all, figure out what's so distinctive about the anthropological perspective. How do we differ from, the geographers, the way a sociologist might pose questions or think about something, and then, or ecologists for that matter, right? So that's, I think, one of the primary goals there is to help students enter domains where we have to specify what's anthropologically insightful, but also it helps teach them anthropological thinking when they actually have to apply these things to a particular problem. And then finally, students, the whys, students begin to wonder why things are the way they are. Rob and I love to spark in students that curiosity to ask questions about our most immediate circumstances. So, I love to get students thinking about the norms and values of reflected in how we use the space of the classroom, right? The students file in without thinking about, they just sit down wherever they are, at the front of the classroom or wherever, and I just love getting students to think about, well, what do they expect to happen, and why is that the way it is? What are our underlying ideologies of how knowledge should be shared? Well, it's very hierarchical if I'm standing at the front of the class and they're sitting down taking notes. So it's beginning to generate that sort of curiosity about questioning why it is things are the way they are.
And of course, contemporary events in the world are often dealing with a lot of unchallenged assumptions about the world. And we as anthropologists, and I'm sure all of you listening to the webinar, have lots of things that happen in the news that you wonder, why don't they see the stupidity of what they're doing in public policy? And it doesn't matter what the field, the aspect of it is, we all are frustrated by that. And bring that into the classroom and talk about it with your students and have fun with it.
So, how do we cultivate critical thinking? Rob, you want to think about
one of the things we've done in our book, on our textbooks, and also in trying to talk about what we're trying to do together, is we've been using Bloom's taxonomy. And Bloom's taxonomy is looking at different levels of critical thinking. There's a lot of teachers that we had in college, or I had in college, because I was in the 70s, I was in school, and it was all about fact-based learning. And so it was all multiple choice with, do you know this fact, and do you know that fact, and do you know the other fact? And most of those facts have never been useful to me, ever. And if I do need them, we got the Google available, as Rachel Maddow always calls it, the Google machine. We've got Google. We can find facts. The critical thing are the upper parts of this this triangle, the applying the facts to things, to analyzing new situations, evaluating things, creating the synthetic analysis. And so what we're trying to do is to push our students further and further up this pyramid to get toward the top, because that's where the payoff is. And all those people that were trained on television, on CNN, and talking about the war on the liberal arts are people that had obviously achieved this in college. And they get bullied by people who were in the more professional school kind of settings. And one of the things anthropologists can really show off is how our students have these skills to be able to tackle any number of things as they move from job to job to job to job in their careers. And many of us have all been moving from job to job in our careers as well. Even Luis, although he's been stable here for the last 15 years, 17 years, something like that.
Years, yeah. Mm-hmm.
He was first in the anthropology department all alone, and then he was starting the global global studies program, and now he's heading the Humanities Center. Each of those has a different way of pitching anthropology, and as we all know, anthropology is a social science, but it's also the humanities. So it's a science and a social science and a humanities, and whatever floats your boat, that's the way to go, and get that our students enjoying those aspects with these higher level critical thinking skills.
Yeah, we in our own testing, for example, we have reorganized how we make sure that students are learning what we want them to learn. And I think a lot of quizzes or a lot of exams are just asking students to throw back what they remember, what they've memorized, maybe understanding that next level up. Did they comprehend what it is that we're asking them to think about? But what we've done is we've taken some of those old techniques of testing, whether it's a multiple choice question or fill in the blank, and we've figured out ways to ask those so that we get students to apply and to analyze as well. And so it's getting beyond our methods of evaluation, or the ways we take for granted certain methods of evaluation that we've learned, and revising them so that we can support these higher level orders of thinking. So how do we actually cultivate curiosity among our students? Well, we think it starts by being quite open about what we know. Anthropology knows a lot. There are consensual understandings of a lot of issues.
And most of you know a lot about a lot of things, probably a lot more about a lot more things and topics than many of your colleagues in other parts of your university.
Right. But then at the same time, there's a lot of debate, right? Debates continue about even very basic matters. And so there's a lot that remains unresolved. And of course, that's why anthropology is such a vibrant field, is that there are new theories emerging and new questions emerging and new techniques of study and analyses and empirical objects. But helping students understand that there are things we know, but that there are other things that are unresolved, sorry about that, is absolutely critical, right? Sorry, I'm going to just unplug my phone. I didn't do that. The next piece of that is that we think that 99% of a good answer is a good question. In other words, the way you set up questions can help guide how you're going to answer them, right? So we want to help. Sorry about that. We want to help students understand that question posing is absolutely critical part of the doing of anthropology. And then finally, we want to model for them the kinds of questions we want to ask. Students don't always know what kinds of questions to ask. They don't always have the confidence to ask questions. Oftentimes we'll get questions that are sort of procedural. Well, professor, is this going to be on the exam? And instead what we want them to be able to do is learn ways of question asking that we ourselves have learned, that we bring with us to particular issues.
And confront anything that's in the environment of the students is really a good way to start. And ask questions that get them to think about what they're doing in their dorms or on their the way they register for classes or any other aspect of your university's life. Get them to think about those and ask questions. Why do we do it that way? Why do you think the administration has set things up like that? You may not, and the other thing is you've got to be willing to know that their questions are going to come up that are going to be, they're going to say, this is just a, oh, I know this is really off the topic question, but invite that. You don't have to know everything. That's the nice thing about it. We're anthropologists, but we know how to go and find answers, but we don't always already know the answers. And accept that. And don't feel like you have to know everything, because we can't all know everything.
Yeah, so Rob and I actually have over the years, in dialogue with each other, developed a very question-centered approach to our pedagogy. It is, broadly problem-centered. In other words, that we're looking at particular problems. But one of the things we really want to do is help our students think more critically about questions and unleash their curiosity by getting them to ask questions. So we think it's important to know the different types of questions. If thinking along that sort of Bloom's taxonomy level, there are certain lower level kinds of questions that we can model for our students, or we can ask them, right? Ask them to provide more evidence if they make a claim. Ask them to, provide more clarification to make sure that they understand what it is they're actually saying. To ask them open-ended questions that might get them to mobilize some of the things that they can remember from what they've read or seen, but also ask that to make sure to explore whether or not they really understood the issue. So that's lower level.
And then we get into higher level questions, and that's when you're trying to get them to pull things together. And so you want to linking or extending questions, things that will take it from the one case study or what they've observed or you've been talking about and apply that to other kinds of situations. Another way is to frame hypothetical. Well, what if we had that fact situation except for one new fact is different? Something else has happened that might be in the picture. And then how would that affect it? But all the time you're role modeling how to ask questions is one of the things that we all do, and both of us do in our classes all the time. And then ask, what's the cause, what's the effect? And we often find in anthropological problems that we look at that there's a sort of chicken-egg problem, that things have evolved together, and so there's two factors that are in tension. And to say, you can't easily say that one is the cause and the other is the effect. They are, in fact, mutually reinforcing each other. And we can think of a lot of those at the symbolic level, at the political economy level, and so forth. Once people get into power and control things, then they have a tendency to continue to control things. And once a dominant symbolic meaning becomes prominent, it's hard to shift. I'm thinking of, for example, one that I've been using this last week is the idea of the Cold War. That was a model of how to understand geopolitics. And that was a classification problem. There was the evil empire and there was the good guys, us. And now, if you listen to public dialogue about what's going on in the Middle East, they're using the politicians are using the same kind of frame of reference to try and explain a much more complicated pattern. It's easy to explain to the students how this classification doesn't work anymore in that new situation. And yet our politicians are talking about it all the time. So get them to start to look for the cause and effect. Why are they still doing that kind of thinking? And it comes from the fact that they've learned this pattern when they were young. And then summary and synthesis questions. Do you want to talk about that, Luis?
Yeah, you know, it's approaching the material you've covered and asking students to make connections between the different kinds of arguments. Questions like, well, what do you think about? Could we combine two different approaches here? Can you summarize the directions that our conversations have gone over the past unit, or something like that, where students are now beginning to think on that sort of more conclusive level. What do we actually know? What do we still not know? What are the connections between these different areas that we might want to keep exploring? Right. So those are the types. That's how we can model questions. And so, how do you do this on a higher level, where you're mobilizing that question-centered approach throughout your whole course? And you know, I organize my syllabi around key questions. You can typically, I've sort of realized that I can explore a big question in about 2 weeks, sometimes a week and a half. So in a 15-week semester, that means I can have upwards of 6, typically, maybe 5 big questions. And so I've identified some good questions, and I've integrated them into my syllabus. I will also have sort of lower level questions or sub-questions that help me answer the big question that I dedicate a class session to, or will pursue over several class sessions.
One of the things that I'm going to be doing tomorrow, I'm doing a course on culture and international business, it's called. It's a general ed course, mostly non-majors in the course. And they're coming from business backgrounds. They want to study business. So we're going to talk about their term project, which is going to be to look at some industry and understand the supply chain and the marketing of those products from an anthropological point of view. Now, they're not thinking anthropologically about this yet. And they wanted me to write up a rubric for them, and I purposely didn't. So tomorrow we're going to write up the rubric together, which is what needs to be in the paper in the presentation at the end of the term. And they've already been working on it, so they actually have gotten their feet wet now. We've talked about it several times during the term already, but now that we're going to sit down and we're going to ask questions about what do we need to know, and how do you present that in a presentation, and how do you present that in a paper in your write-up. And I'm going to get them to write up the rubric for us, because they would love to have me just type it up and send it to them. But that's too easy. I want them to get engaged in the whole process of what is their project all about. And by the end of the hour tomorrow, they will all have have got that under the belt?
I think it's important to dwell on questions as well. Give students a sense of why this question is important to us. What are some of the debates around the way this question has been addressed over time? Why are we still struggling with this question? I think it's critical to not just sort of do a flyby on big important questions, but to actually take class time and give students a better, deeper context for why this question or why the particular questions you want to pursue are important.
We also think you have to revisit interesting questions throughout your term, or periodically come back to them. One of the techniques I have used that I've been fairly successful with, but it only works if you've got students who are fairly self-secure. But if you get some older students in a class that already know who they are and they're not terrified of being in an anthro class, and they ask a question that I can call on them. I can recall their question, and John's question from the other day asked the same thing when we talk with somebody who's getting to this. If we look at it, this new problem from the perspective that John gave us the other day, and I had to tell them, I'm not picking on John. I just am using that as a frame of reference. And John has already moved well beyond that, of course. And then usually John comes up or Sally comes up, and they have shown how they've gotten beyond that stumbling block. But again, you're bringing back the same thing. Similarly, when I write holism on the board the first day, and I keep coming back to how do we understand this set of things that come together in this new fact situation? And pretty soon you find after a couple of weeks, everybody's saying, oh, this is holism again. Mm-hmm. And then you keep coming back to that.
I think it's important, too, to ask questions we don't know the answer to. Some of that is I like to situate myself oftentimes as a master learner. I'm still learning things, in some cases right alongside my students, but I'm ahead of them on so many other levels. But in asking questions and inviting questions that I don't know the answer to, it's not just a way of showing that I still have things that I'm learning, our discipline still has things that we learn, but it gives me a chance to model for them how I would approach an answer to a question. And I think that's a lot of what we can do as teachers is begin a process of learning by modeling for students what we want them to be able to do. And so if they ask me something I don't know the answer to, certainly I'd say I'm going to try and find the answer to that. But here, let me think aloud here, where I think one way to answer it might be the following. And then finally, there are questions we can't answer using current techniques or whatever. They fall too far outside the realm of what our discipline is interested in or can claim some authority over. But those questions are great too, because you can start talking about the limits of anthropological disciplinary interest or knowledge, and maybe we can't answer them now, but maybe we could answer them later if we have different conditions.
And one of the things that's really important is throughout the term have different activities or assignments that will bring students back to asking questions. So when you're talking about an activity that you've already had them do, let's have them now step back from what they've already done and ask some questions about it that they wouldn't have been able to do before that, for example.
I do this as quiz questions. Instead of telling me what do you remember about the reading, I'll ask them to pose some questions about a situation or a topic, just check in on, are they developing the ability to ask good anthropological questions, and then they can get some feedback from me. And then random questions is a technique that I use. This is what I use in my big intro classes of 200 or more to really unleash that curiosity, unleash in a kind of a sort of excitement in a big class where students' stock position is, I'm in here to be infotained. I'm not going to engage. I'm just going to take notes. I don't know anybody. The random questions is I invite students to ask me anything about anything. My assertion being that anthropology has something interesting or insightful to say about virtually anything. So the random questions really begin to flow, and I take time I quote-unquote sacrifice content in order to address these random questions, because what I'm doing here is I'm modeling for students how an anthropologist thinks and would ask or would address a particular curiosity. But it also means that students are contributing to the content of the class. In other words, it's not just me delivering a set curriculum to them, but they're actually participating in helping shape what we're going to talk about in the class. And, you know, mind you, this is 10 minutes at the beginning of a 50-minute class or something like that. But I find what it does is it really opens up a classroom to discussion. So if you're, you know, I've had the experience where the random questions will really energize 200-person classroom to the point where hands start shooting up, hands that haven't said anything, right? And I like that too, because it keeps it lively for me. I'm not just teaching the same things over and over again. So how do we encourage interactive learning among our students?
Well, I think you need to make learning and asking questions and interaction key to your learning strategy, your teaching strategy. And start that from the very first day of class. I always have my students, I ask questions, I tell them a little bit of an intro about something that's in the news. They're undergraduates, they haven't heard about it, so I give them some facts to work on and then start asking them questions. And of course, they're not used to answering those questions because they never thought about this. And I keep telling them throughout the term, look, nobody here has thought about this problem. In fact, I hadn't thought about it until yesterday, and when I decided I'm going to talk about this today. So confront new material and make it exciting, but start from the very, very beginning.
I like to decenter my students from day one so that they are expecting in a way the unexpected. And so I have a bunch of techniques from you know, speaking in Spanish to a not Spanish-speaking class, and after a few minutes, asking them to respond to what they thought when I came in speaking Spanish, and they're responding to each other, so they're interacting with each other within 3 minutes of the very first class. When what they expected was for me to just pass out the syllabus and tell them what they need to do and then call it a day. So it's from being very thoughtful about your not just day one, but the first 2 weeks of the semester, to really get them interacting with each other. And again, it means, quote unquote, sacrificing content in order to engage in process. Because if you've done this every day for the first 2 weeks, for the rest of the semester, students are accustomed to that. They've learned the culture of your classroom, which is, oh, we're going to be interacting with each other. We're going to be interacting with the professor.
Luis and I think a lot alike about many of these topics, but our personal styles are very different.
Yeah.
And yet we both use similar kinds of techniques, but we do it a little bit differently that fits into our own personality. And you've got to do the same. Model your own behavior in terms of it makes sense to you, who you are. And we don't say that what we do or what he does or what I do is better than what you do. What's going to work for you is what works for you. So use what your own resources and abilities are.
Yeah.
Run with those.
Well, and you always want to give them something compelling to work with. We've said this in various ways. It's, you know, showing an issue, a problem that is important, that is relevant to the world that they live in right now. And you have to trust your students. We cede control to our students by letting them talk to each other, by asking them to undertake certain kinds of activities. And having trust in students can really generate that level of comfort in the classroom where they're going to begin interacting with each other and with you. And warm up, you know, I call it calisthenics. I have a process in place so that if I know I want to have a discussion on any given class, I work them up to the discussion. I don't just start it right off. No one's ready when they walk in the classroom, or if they've been lectured at for the past 20 minutes to just suddenly engage in a deep conversation. It's, you know, maybe it starts with a free write, and then it moves to a small group discussion, and then you bring it to the full class. And I do this again at all scales, so 200 students or 20 students.
What I do with my students is with any reading that we've gotten, I want to talk about the reading in class. We may not deal exhaustively with that reading, but if I'm going to ask them to read it, I want to talk about it with them. And so I've come up with a device that I call my 4 questions. Who is the author? What's the author's question? What's the author's methodology? What's the author's answer? There's also a 5th question that I use with upper division students, juniors and seniors. Why did that author write that book, that essay at that time, at that moment in time? And these are all about getting this, teasing out the critical thinking. So once students have written those 4 questions up when they bring those to class for something we're going to talk about, they're usually awful, absolutely awful at the beginning of the term. But I have them turn it in. I don't grade them. I check them off that they turned them in. But I'm looking at them and I'm seeing that how they're growing through the term. By halfway through the term, they're all doing it fairly well. But the last 3 or 4 weeks, you don't really need to do it anymore. They already do it automatically. Mm-hmm. And what you're doing is teaching them to think critically about their readings.
Class size is big, a big factor in all of this. And as you get into the larger classes, logistics become ever more critical. And so, having a plan in place, having all the materials you need in place, having your TAs lined up, trained, ready to go, whatever it is, as you scale up, logistics become more and more important. So giving that a lot of attention and a lot of thought. So that you aren't spending that class time setting things up, but you have the plan ready to go. One of the ways I do that is in a big class, I'll have a worksheet, have people work through something, and then their head is in it, and then we'll have some instructions after that of what could turn to your neighbors and then address these issues. But that's one of the key pieces of a worksheet. Free writes can do that just as well. Have students respond to a question or an issue that you've posed in an open-ended way, and then you have the follow-up plan of what do you want them to do with each other. We think it's important to use technology here to amplify, not replace. I mean, Rob mentioned that he does online teaching, but with things like Blackboard and so on, we can turn to chats and we can turn to blogs and wikis and so on. Those things should never replace what you want to achieve in the classroom, but they can really amplify what you want to do in the classroom. So it could be on the preparatory level, or it could be later after an activity. You ask people to weigh in together. But we never want to replace that interactive engagement with technology.
And I understand everything that I do in the classroom is kind of role modeling what we as anthropologists do, and that's what I want my students to see. And I do it every day in the classroom. Some days we're off, but we're still trying to model how, even when you don't understand what's exactly where the class is going, you still have to role model how to do that, and you have to start to feel comfortable with whatever course the classroom takes.
I organize summits in my big classes, also my smaller classes, but the idea of a summit is you pick an issue or a big problem, and you recognize that there are more than 2 sides to any issue, and so you pre-assign sort of positions on a big debate. Let's say it's climate change, and you want to have a climate change summit, and you just sort of organize, okay, these 3 people are going to be this country and that country and that country and that country. So you're organizing students ahead of time. They work outside of class. They come in. They present their position in that issue. And then what I found that can do is generate a lot of really interesting conversation in a big class, because the students have done some preliminary work. They've had a conversation in front of the other students about the issue, and then we open it up. Assignment tracks is another possibility here. Assignment tracks is when you've got a huge class, 300 students, and what you want to do is provide some students, the students who are more engaged, more motivated, potentially majors or minors that you want to recruit, to say we're gonna have small group discussions with you or with TAs. We're going to have an ethnographic exercise. We're going to have some problem-solving sessions where we look at some issue in the news. But not all students are doing that, right? That's maybe the majority of students are doing the traditional quizzes, a midterm, final exam. And so these assignment tracks is a way of diversifying and breaking up the big class so that you do have some students are really intensively interacting with each other, and other students who are choosing not to do that aren't, right? And then finally, you can design a hybrid course. We're exploring that a lot in higher ed right now, where part of the instruction might be happening online. the other part face-to-face. One of the ways we're using that here at the University of Vermont is there will be an online dimension that maybe is a short lecture, a half-an-hour lecture, or it's me modeling something for my students. And then half the students are doing that for that particular day's class, and the other half are in class with me, and we're actually involved in some kind of activity. So a face-to-face interactive thing. So it's a way of taking a big class and beginning to break it up so that you do have the time and the ability to get students to interact with each other when the other half of the class is doing something more traditional.
There's another way of talking about that that's now becoming very popular, is flipping the classroom.
Yes.
And so you're going to hear that a lot in the near future. So anyway, we're kind of done with what we have to say, but we're happy to answer questions or make comments on whatever your thoughts are. Anybody have any questions?
Excellent. So, as Rob just mentioned, we'll be starting our question and answer session. And feel free to type your questions into the question box, which should be between polls and chat and underneath attendees too. And I'll be reading them out loud for our panelists to answer. Well, I have a quick question. So what brought you both into anthropology in the first place? What was your experience in the academic classroom, possibly, or beyond, when you were an undergrad or graduate that made you think, well, I like anthropology. Let's go into this.
Okay. Well, I started this earlier than Luis because I'm a bit older than he is. And I was signed up for a sociology class, and the girlfriend of one of my buddies, I was an astronomy major at the time, said, I've got to take this anthropology class. Why don't you take it with me so we can sit together? It was a huge lecture class taught by Edward T. Hall, the proximicist, and he showed films of people, a person from the United States and a person from Turkey having a conversation. And the Turk wanted to be very close when he spoke, and the American wanted to be further apart. So they ended up walking down this long, long corridor, and there was a film of that. And when I realized how so much of what we see in actual life we don't notice, it got me very excited. And he showed a lot of films in that class, which were ethnographic films, early classics, dead birds and things of that sort. It got me very excited. And I still try and use a lot of those observation exercises to get my students to see things they would never see before.
Yeah, in my case, I think I experienced the sage on a stage model. I didn't question it. I was taking an introduction to anthropology class and I was being told what anthropology is. I don't remember actually having much discussion or being asked to process that material. But I did find myself actually doing that outside of class, and part of it is that, I grew up in a bicultural household, and I started seeing how anthropology was helping me think back on my own experience of navigating two different cultures. In the case of my dad is from Chile, and I started sort of thinking anthropologically about the way he would approach issues and why that seemed to be different from my mom, who was raised in California. And so, I started just applying anthropology in my everyday life, and that really helped me understand that the power of anthropology was that it provides a lens, a way of thinking, an approach to issues, and I just started using that. I was very inspired. In the end, I decided to pursue a graduate school in that, not because I was convinced I would somehow get an academic job, because I wasn't even sure I could, but it was just I wanted to really refine that lens and be able to apply it in almost any professional direction I could take it. I really feel like anthropology is, our students are very well-refined Swiss Army knives when they come out, like those big fat ones with all kinds of tools on them, because we have the communicative tools, the writing tools, the critical thinking tools, the curiosity tools, the question-posing tools, and that really became apparent to me from my first moments of taking anthropology classes.
And we feel strongly that if students learn to think anthropologically, then they are ready for anything that you throw at them because they can handle it. And I think it's an unsung aspect of our discipline that we we train students to think critically and give them these real tools, this toolkit.
Great, thank you. And our question from Phil Carr is beyond holism, what do you consider keys to think anthropologically for your intro class?
Well, obviously cultural relativism is one, but I frame it typically as critical relativism. It's not a sort of, everyone kind of does what they want and we accept that. But it's understanding the conditions under which a group of people might come to think the ways they think, including ourselves, right? It's what are these conditions of possibility that might lead people to act and behave and think in certain ways. And having said that, it doesn't mean that I individually have to accept everything that this group of people does, right? But, it's that old classic, well, if we're a cultural relativist, then, Nazi ideology that can generate a Holocaust is acceptable within that cultural worldview. Rather, I think what it is that, we develop a critical angle, but only after we've made a serious attempt to understand the conditions under which a group of people might think a certain way. I use the example of circumcision. Circumcision is an abhorrent practice across the world, yet we take it for granted. And why is that? And you go into the history of why it is that we have circumcision as the most common surgery in this country. And it's only after understanding that background that I think we can then say, okay, yeah, I don't think circumcision is such a great idea or whatever.
And I think to build on that, I think if we understand different positions from different countries, like, for example, dealing with what's going on in eastern Ukraine right now, if you just frame it as many political scientists and many politicians will do, oh, Putin's being evil, he's just KGB, and there may be aspects of that that are relevant, but that isn't the whole story. And so trying to show how the models that we have have been constructed, and I definitely come from a constructivist view of culture, how our models of the Cold War shape how we deal with Putin today, and how the public discourse. It's very easy to show this constructed notion of what Putin is doing. And one assumes that in any fact situation, that's just a very simple one that you can see how the old model is being applied. And it seems to work so nicely until you ask, well, why is he doing it if it's not getting him a lot of good at home? And then all of a sudden you start looking at what's happening at home, and you can then piece together all the elements of construction.
I think another key thing that is important about anthropological thinking that I like to teach is about change and how we understand change. That change is at the heart of the world we live in, that things are, there are certain patterns, and that we're really good as anthropologists at identifying those patterns, but at the same time it's then understanding conditions of change and social change. And I think anthropology offers a lot of powerful tools to help think through how change occurs, why it occurs. And this is partly why Rob and I really like to use contemporary examples in our classroom to really highlight how anthropology can help students understand the dynamism of the world that we live in.
We do draw upon the classic literature in our teaching. Because I work in New Guinea, I do talk about the Kula Ring a fair bit. But there's more to New Guinea than just the Kula Ring. And most students are never going to need to know anything about the Kula Ring and the Kula valuables and even who Malinowski was. Most of us will know something about that. But you can use that. But then let's talk about exchange in our own society over birthday presents, and what do your friends in your dorms exchange presents over? You'll find some of your female students will be exchanging gifts with their friends on campus. And what are the limits on that? Get them to explore that. So all of these are, how do these models come to be, and how are they rooted in the real world? So while we're constructivists in many ways, we also deal with real life, concrete facts of life as part of what we're dealing with. I think that kind of gets at how some of the other concepts that we're dealing with.
Great, definitely. So Our next questions are actually, they tie together, so I'm going to give both of them to you at once. The first one is by Madeline Duntley, and she asks, can you say more about the logistics of assignment tracks in large classes? And then to follow up with that, Adam Green actually asked, how do you integrate evaluation with different assignment tracks? So I think there's just some questions about how you work assignment tracks based on different class sizes and how to effectively put them into your course structure.
I'll let you deal with that one.
Yeah, you do need to give this a lot of thought, and what I would say is this has to be very clear to students from the very first day that they have a choice that they need to make, and they need to make it very quickly by the end of the first week about what track they're going to be on. As I say, the majority of students are going to go with the quote-unquote traditional track, which is for a big course going to probably be the easiest one for a professor to run. It's going to be quizzes, it's going to be a midterm, it's going to be a final. There might be other things you throw in there, but it's making clear that that's the track that I would expect most students to choose. Then you can create some more customized tracks that are appealing to the student that wants to get more out of your class, that really wants to work harder or maybe learn the skills of anthropology. And so, there's multiple possibilities for tracks, and I would say use your imagination to do it. But what I've done is a kind of a pre-major track. Those students who think they might want to major or minor in the field, that's when you can give them, go out and do an ethnographic observation assignment where, they're actually spending out of class time, and then they're going to write up a little report on that. If you've got 200 students, you can't read the. I don't have TAs here at UVM, so I have to do the work myself. I can't read 200 field reports. I can do peer review with that, but that can be difficult in a big intro class. So anyway, then they get my attention in this smaller track. I'll respond very intensively to their research memos. You can also give them the opportunity to organize summits. I've had my special track students do summits in class, which is, okay, folks, go out there, here's the problem, here I'm going to group you into different groups, and then you're going to present in front of the rest of us so that they have an opportunity to present. And then I'll give them feedback on their presentation so that they, again, in a big intro class where you can't normally do that for everybody, they do get some intensive feedback. You can add other kinds of things that you can do in a smaller, that you can imagine doing in a smaller class. Abstracts. Write an abstract of this article we just read. And the fact is that it's going to be a minority of students that do that. One of the possibilities that I'm exploring right now is a third track of a kind of service learning track. And that's not a whole semester-long, full-blown service project, but trying to integrate a service opportunity in our community or on campus into my course so that the students that are interested in learning anthropological thinking or skills through that community engagement could do it. So for example, what is it that anthropologists often do service learning around? It's, helping do basic research on a problem for an organization. Well, let's have the anthropology students begin to do some of that basic research, and then I can work with them. I think the other thing you can add in any smaller track is group discussions that are facilitated by you and maybe some undergraduate seniors or some other, advanced undergraduate TAs that you might have if you don't have grad students, which can get them talking in smaller groups about what it is you want them to talk about.
One thing that I have done, I have smaller classes, so I don't deal with what Lisa's been talking about very often anymore. But I have students that are doing need to get honors credit, so they're doing a special project, which amounts to the same thing. And we talk in office hours about their project. They write it up, and then I have them present at the end of the term. And so there's more mundane ways of actually doing this kind of tracking.
Great. I believe we have time for one more question. Is that good for both of you?
Yeah, sure.
Great. So our last question will be, so Barbara Hughes asks, can you give an example of a question that you would ask to engage students in your introduction class?
Boy, where to start?
What don't we ask questions about?
Yeah,
That's what we're thinking.
I know. Let's see.
Well, for example, when we had when the recent thing with the Ebola virus coming out and Governor Christie quarantining the health worker from Maine as she came back, that was just unnatural. What's going on there was the first question. And I got them thinking about that. And it's about the construction of the idea of contagious disease. It's about the construction of Africa being a very different and dangerous place. And it followed on the death of an African who came to the United States. And it came on the idea that this is a contagious disease that's going to spread everywhere. And all of those things are things that you can construct. And then you can ask, why is that? Why are each of those understandings of this situation popularly understood? Because the news media ran away with it. At the same time, we all know that biology of Ebola as such, it's a very difficult case to spread. It turns out the first guy who died, his family was in the house with him with the bed sheets that had his blood and all the Ebola virus on them for almost a week before they were moved out of there. None of them got Ebola. It's very difficult to transmit. And so then you start talking, that's biology, and then you deal with all the different holistic aspects. And so these are the kinds of ways I would go about it.
There's another, one of the, I love to get students thinking anthropologically through food, and of course they love to as well. And so, I often ask the question, are we, are you what you eat? And oftentimes, I'll start it with a scenario. So an interesting scenario to think about is, the fact that in India you have this really sharp division between the middle and upper classes who increasingly are suffering from type 2 diabetes, is disease of the prosperous. It's, they're very well nourished, right? And they have the highest rates of diabetes in the world now. And then they have, several hundred million malnourished people. And so you have these extremes. And you have farmers, for example, who are trapped in these debt cycles because their agricultural system is changing and they can't afford the pesticides and so on. So they're in debt and they're drinking the poison that and they're committing suicide. So then I ask students like, well, how do you explain that, right? How do we explain that divergent pathways in one country's foodways? And then, that's a big question, right? And so I'll say, okay, well, let's start with some sub-questions that we need to do to ask that. Are we really what we eat? What is the biology of food consumption, right? And what are the foodways that people have in their lives that turn them biologically, at least, into who they are? And then we get into questions like, well, why are some foods considered disgusting by some and others are delicious? Why is it that, Indians think that beef is abhorrent to eat, right? But we seem to love it. So I like to have these big questions, and then I offer subsidiary questions that help us get into the different pieces of the big question. Then we can come back around to the bigger questions and hopefully answer them in a more thoughtful way.
And I think you can see that the two of us kind of tackle the same kinds of questions with different strategies. And sometimes I like to start out with a concrete case and see what the question really is. Luis often starts with big questions and then finds cases that flush it out. There's nothing better about either one of them. It's only about whether it's exciting to you. And if you have the excitement about dealing with questions that you're confronting, the students will be too. So I want to thank you all for being here with us. We really enjoyed this, and we hope to meet you in person at the AAAs or something like that.
Yes, thank you very, very much. We really appreciate your attention and questions.
Excellent. So for everyone who is on the line and anyone who is unable to be with us today in the webinar, we will be having the recording up on YouTube if you're interested in watching the session again, or if you're interested in sharing it with any of your faculty. Please feel free to keep in touch if you have any questions at all. And once again, I just want to thank everyone for attending today and for sharing your good thoughts with us. If we did not get to your question in the webinar, we'll be happy to send them over to our presenters, and they'll be more than happy to answer. And also, again, thank you so much, Drs. Robert Welsch and Luis Vivanco, for presenting today.
It's our pleasure.
Thank you, our pleasure.
Excellent. Excellent. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye now.